Every week, Jesse Jenkins, my co-host, and I host a weekly podcast called Shift Key about decarbonization and the shift away from fossil fuels. And each week, at the end of the episode, we take one item of news, one piece of climate or energy news that has really caught our attention for that week. And if it's making us feel more optimistic about the energy transition, we call it an upshift. If it's making us feel more pessimistic, we call it a downshift. Jesse, what do you have for us?
Well, I've got an upshift for us this week after a long string of downshifts, and that is coming out of a report from the International Energy Agency on the outlook for global oil consumption in 2024. And what they show is a substantial deceleration in the growth of global oil demand. In fact, in 2024, growth in demand for oil from road transportation, picking up on the theme of our most recent episode here, has been completely eliminated. So no increase in demand for oil use for, gasoline, diesel, road transportation, and that's across all segments.
Globally.
Drivers globally, right? The only drivers of growth in global oil demand in 2024 came out of the aviation and shipping sectors. I imagine that's mostly aviation and chemical feedstocks. So producing plastics and chemicals and other non-fuel products. And this is a substantial decline. It's about a 1 million per day, it's just shy of actually 0.8 million barrels per day increase in global demand. That's down from about 1.8 million barrels of growth in 2023. So we dropped about 1 million barrels per day. And that trend has been sustained since 2021, when we had a big surge post-pandemic in increased road transportation consumption. That post-pandemic surge is now over. And at least in the rich world, the developed countries, the US and Europe and elsewhere, demand for road transportation and oil overall is still well below 2019 levels, despite that several years of rebounding demand after the pandemic. So if this trend continues and we shave off, say, another 1 million barrels per day of growth in 2025, that would actually push global oil demand negative for the year. So we would actually see a decline in global consumption, or at least a plateau in total consumption of oil writ large. And if this trend again continues for multiple years, what that would do is basically push us into structural decline in global oil demand. So this is, one of those tipping points, right, to keep a close eye on. All the world's major economies at this point are basically contributing to this trend, particularly the decline in demand in road transportation. The US, that's largely improvements in fuel economy and a bit of EVs. But Europe and China, it's largely electrification, which is driving that trend. And that is going to become a decreasing source of consumption globally, it looks like. And so the question basically is, how long will it take for declining consumption in road transportation to offset any continued growth in aviation and petrochemical feedstocks? And that might be coming very soon.
That's good news. I mean, I feel like
very good news.
We don't know what happens next. Like, what could happen next is plastic sop up all that extra demand, right? Like from oil production. But it's still, wow. This has been so often made, but it does feel like when you hear news like that we're looking at a world where peak oil is on the demand side and not on the supply side as we thought it would be 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's remarkable. Yeah, that we're not running out of oil. We're running out of demand for oil because of demand destruction from electrification and efficiency improvements. That's what an energy transition looks like, right? In fact, as a share of global energy consumption, oil's share is now down below 30% for the first time ever. That it peaked 50 years ago at almost half, at 46% of global consumption. So, this is one of those things where, again, like total consumption has to fall before we think of it really as a transition and not just addition of new sources. But oil is not the number one fuel anymore. It's declining. We're starting to see electrification on a sustained basis destroy demand for oil in the motor vehicle sector.
I mean, if you think about all the language we use to talk about energy, or so much of the language we use to talk about energy is actually based around this idea of fixed oil supply, right? Even the fact that what made wind and solar attractive at the beginning of their technological life was that they were renewable, and that's what we call them,
right?
Because oil and coal and natural gas were non-renewable, and the assumption was that we were going to run out. Yeah. And instead, the renewability of renewables is not what has ultimately given them a decisive advantage in the energy industry. It's the manufacturability of renewables and their zero operating costs, right?
Yeah, and the fact that they're immune to the kind of global price shocks that you see in the oil and gas markets, including when a new shooting war erupts in the Middle East at, random Thursdays. You don't see the price of wind farms skyrocket after these kinds of events. But of course, oil and gas are on a kind of global roller coaster in terms of price up and down. Rob, how about you? What do you got this week?
I have a downshift.
Well, we got to balance out here.
I can't hide it, Jesse. I have a downshift. So one thing that my old colleague Derek Thompson talks about is how The Trump administration is distinctive because lots of things happen, but then lots of things unhappen. And that means it can be very difficult, very hard to keep a beat on what the current policy is. So I want to just update people on where policy stands that they may not be following. I'm going to read now from a story by my colleague, Joe Holtzman. Back on Trump's first day in office, Trump issued 2 executive orders threatening the wind energy industry. One halted solar and wind approval for 60 days, and another told all federal agencies to, quote, not issue new or renewed approvals, rights of way, permits, leases, or loans for all wind projects until the completion of a new government review for the entire wind industry. Since then, as Heatmap was among the first to report, I think as we were the first to report, the solar pause was lifted. And the Bureau of Land Management has now approved a bunch of solar projects. And the Department of Energy has actually approved an offshore wind project as well. But for land-based wind projects, onshore wind projects, so to speak, the normal kind you see when you drive your car through the prairie, there does still seem to be some kind of pause in effect. So specifically the Fish and Wildlife Service, which has to approve projects that could affect endangered birds, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which has to approve projects that could have a nexus with the federal wetlands or federal waters, seem to have basically stopped processing all wind project permit applications, and those pauses have not been lifted during the Trump administration. And we know this because of filings submitted to a federal court case on Monday or last week, alleging that at least 3 projects in New York State have been paused, as well as 3 wind projects in Arizona, all of which cumulatively add up to billions of dollars of potential capital investments. And so the Trump administration, right, they have this incredibly fickle policy impetus, and they announce things and the announcements get a ton of attention, but then the announcements slowly get lifted. And that's happened on solar. The federal government is permitting solar projects again, but it's still seemingly not permitting wind, or some agencies still aren't permitting wind. And I just want to highlight this as a downshift because the industry feels like it's in a better place. And yet the government's still using these procedural roadblocks and still using its ability to approve these individual projects to block wind projects as a policy matter. And that's obviously really quite bad for the energy transition, and it's bad for the U.S. emissions trajectory. And it's bad for the industry.
I have a hard time understanding how that's legal. Not that has stopped the administration from issuing many ultimately illegal executive order, but the part of the reason we know about this is because lawsuits have been filed to try to overturn this decision. I mean, it just seems like the definition of arbitrary and capricious, which is the thing you're not allowed to do in administrative law, right? I mean, they have a statutory obligation to process permits and requests. You can reject those on substantive grounds, but simply sitting on them for any indeterminate amount of time and not returning people's phone calls, that seems to be arbitrary, capricious, and not in keeping with their statutory obligations. So I hope that these lawsuits are the impetus for kicking them back into gear. I also wonder how much of this is just lack of staffing in the DOGE era, or maybe it's not a top-down directive. It's just staffers being worried about doing anything that might get them on the wrong side of DOGE and the political appointees by approving a wind farm that the president turns out doesn't like. So they have purposely, as they've talked about, created this climate of fear amongst civil servant employees. And that could also be one of the reasons why we're not seeing any movement in these agencies. It's just unclear exactly what the justification is here. And so we don't really know why this is happening. But clearly not good for the industry, like you said. And one of those things I hope that we can see some progress on soon.
Jesse, I couldn't put it any better myself. As you said, we know about all of this because of filings and lawsuits. Even if the lawsuits ultimately resolve positively, it still adds all this cost to development.
Yeah, time, delay, cost, risk.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because what does the Trump administration talk about? They talk about how they want to reduce the cost of American investments, right? They want to make it easier to invest in the United States.
But only certain types of investments.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Well, hey, that brings us to the end of Upshift Downshift for today. If you enjoyed this, we have a whole podcast for you. And we have it every week, every Wednesday, in fact. And you can find it at heatmap.news or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or the French one, Deezer. It's always free. And we have great interviews with folks from across the energy industry and across the energy transition. So I hope you enjoy us. And thanks as always for watching.